Hey there everybody, it's Nathan Cool with NathanCoolPhoto.com, and in this episode I want to address two of the most common questions that I get asked, and that's what camera and what lens is best for real estate photography. Now that's a loaded couple of questions because there's so many factors that depend on what you may already have, if you're just starting out, what point you are in your career with real estate photography, and also especially now there's a lot of cameras coming out that are mirrorless. Even Nikon, Canon, they're catching up to Sony. So now that we're going into 2021, what would be the best camera to use for real estate photography and what lens to go along with that? As we all know, cameras and lenses can get very expensive for real estate photography. There's somewhat of a balance. So I'm going to be covering a lot throughout this video. Now just real quick, just to let you know, I've got a lot of notes down here. So from time to time, I'm going to be looking down to capture some of those. Don't mean to be rude looking down. But anyways, make sure I cover every single thing. And throughout the agenda here, what I'm going to be covering, I'm going to be covering the gear that's mostly toward the interior and exterior real estate photography. Now, you know that I use different cameras and lenses also for doing the video work, for doing virtual tours. So this is mostly for the interior and exterior work. So what I'm going to do is cover some overall recommendations, and I'm going to start just some fundamentals. And I'm going to start talking about DSLR bodies, DSLR lenses, and then get into mirrorless bodies and lenses as well and start talking about some of those and some options that you may look at going into this year. Also, then after looking at all the various options, I'm going to look at some quality comparisons to show how things kind of rank, and does that really match up to some of the price that these things are charging? Is it worth it for real estate photography? Once again, maybe other genres of photography, those cameras may work better. I'm going to cover a little bit on tilt shift lenses. As you know, I'm not really a huge fan of that anymore. That's more of a film days. I know there's people that just love their tilt shift lenses, so I'm going to cover some of that so you have a little more insight into that and help you make a decision if you think that would be something worthwhile having in your quiver of equipment. Also then, at the very end of this, I'm going to list my top 3 choices for pairing cameras and lenses so you have a little better idea. But once again, it's a matter of knowing some of the whys behind the whats. Now, as far as the whats, I've got a whole bunch of links down in the description for this video of the various gear I'm going to talk about here. Along with that, to know some of the whys behind it and also how to use some of this as well during your shoots at real estate photography gigs that you might be getting. I've got a whole list of books. I've got 7 of them right now in my series for real estate photography, and so I have a link to that series in the description for this video as well. So to start right out of the gate here on what we're going to be looking at, yes, it's going to be mostly Nikon, Canon, Sony. I'm going to touch on a few other things though too, because now there's also Fuji has come out with some great options. Fuji's got, for instance, the TX4. You've also got Panasonic, which has come out with the GH5S, and both of those are super fantastic video cameras. So they really specialize in that more, but it is something to think about. Well, would they work for real estate photography? I'm just going to touch a little bit on the Fuji as well as the Nikon, Canon, and Sony, but I'm really not going to touch on the Panasonic. It's a great video camera, it's very affordable, but it does have micro four thirds sensor. It's just not really living up to some of the expectations you may want for real estate photography, and those are some of the fundamentals that I will be covering. Also, we know that Olympus this year did get bought out. Olympus isn't going away, so if you're an OMD shooter, then you will be able to now get their products through the OMD Digital Solutions, which is the new branded name now for all the Olympus cameras and lenses for their line. So anyways, the Canon, Nikon, Sony, those top 3 players in the game. Sony entered the mirrorless market early. They've definitely been the 800-pound gorilla in the market. Nikon and Sony Nikon and Canon are just catching up with Sony, but there are some new offerings and some things are starting to improve, so things to look for in that market. But once again, is it pragmatic for real estate photography? So with real estate photography, there is a balance, right? Because if it's a business decision. This isn't just, hey, I'd like to have a great camera for travel. I'd like to have one to play around with, shooting the kids, or taking this out on nature hikes, or whatever it is you want to do, or some art projects. But this is actually a business decision. So like other pro work, if you were a wedding photographer or a professional portrait photographer, or you did automobile or food or whatever the genre was, then you know you need cameras that can take a certain amount of abuse. You also need a camera that can provide a high level of quality, but if you go too expensive, it may be overkill for your business, so you have to kind of weigh those options. So once again, if you go too cheap, then you might not get the high-end work in real estate photography. Remember that real estate photography, it's not just shooting listings for agents, but eventually also working up to doing architectural photography, shooting for builders, developers, designers, stagers, magazines also. So when you have a good set of gear that falls in kind of a sweet spot to quality and price, then you've got a viable business decision with that. Something that I cover, by the way, in the Business Techniques book more in depth. Also, another thing to consider is the third-party lens availability. When you buy into a brand, you don't necessarily want to buy always the OEM lenses. They can be very expensive. I'm going to cover some of the differences here as well for some of the OEM lenses compared to third-party lenses when it comes to real estate photography choices in lenses. So something though to think about. So if you buy into a Fuji, if you buy into a Panasonic or Olympus, you might find that there's fewer OEM lenses compared to Nikon, Canon, and Sony, because being the real big leaders out there, other lens manufacturers want to jump on board, make profit from people that have those primary cameras. So they put a lot of their effort into that. So you have a lot more choice. And of course, Canon, tons of lenses that have existed for years. So you've got and same with Nikon, you've got a lot of choices there. So anyways, it's something to think about. Also, another thing when it comes to the business decision of buying any gear for any professional photography, especially real estate photography, you need redundancy. You can't just buy a camera and a lens, because it will fail at some point, or could fail. It could get banged up, something could go wrong. You need to have a backup, and it needs to be with you on site. So as you know, if you've read my books, other videos, you've seen where I carry 2 cameras with me as a minimum at all times when I'm at a real estate photography shoot. In my case, one I use for exteriors, one I use for interiors, same body, I can switch them back and forth. And yes, they are different lenses, which I'll cover here also, and the reasons why, something to think about. But at least when it comes to a body, an ecosystem that goes along with that, it's always good to think in 2s. So when you find something for a price, multiply it times 2, because that would be your business decision for investing in some of your initial gear. Same goes with tripods, tripod heads, just about everything. You don't want to wait a week for something to be delivered and lose your gigs because something was stolen, something was broke. So you want to have those backups. Also, something to consider before moving forward on getting into some of the gear itself. Another fundamental to remember is that bodies, camera bodies, don't last forever. They take use and abuse more than the lenses do, especially if you're using manual focus lenses. Those things will last a lifetime. Lenses with motors, yeah, the motors can sometimes wear out a little bit. They might get a little wonky on some of the autofocus stuff, but the bodies themselves are just almost disposable. So if you invest $6,000 in a camera body, yeah, it might last you quite a while. You know, you can usually get a couple 100,000 shutter clicks out of a camera body. For myself, I like to go at about 100,000 clicks, and then I retire that body into something else. For instance, my interior bodies take tons of abuse. I go through at least one interior body every year with over 100,000 clicks, and so then when it gets to that point, I get another body, and that one may go toward doing virtual tours, or it may go toward my exterior camera, something like that. And if it gets then too high, then it's time to eBay it and get a few bucks back. But they take a lot of abuse, especially in some genres. Real estate photography doing interiors is one of those areas. So something to think about is that if you're looking at a body now, you're probably not going to be looking at that body in a couple years, but you will be looking at the ecosystem. So next up, let's start diving into the DSLR bodies, and I'll talk about the lenses, get into mirrorless and all those other topics shortly, but first, DSLR bodies. So with the onset and the advent of all the mirrorless solutions out there, a lot of photographers are very concerned that having a DSLR is going to date them, or they're going to be in trouble later because they haven't built up enough gear to support mirrorless cameras. And that is a very valid concern because a lot of photographers compare that to the film days, when nowadays it's very rare to find a film camera, and usually that's for purists who really want something artistic of what they're working with, but it's been done very, very little for real commercial work, and it's done absolutely, I'd probably say zero, for real estate photography. So are we going to get caught in that same thing? Well, I can assure you that DSLRs are not going away anytime soon. So according to the Camera and Imaging Products Association, CIPA, mirrorless is definitely becoming more popular, and about 2/3 of all cameras, for instance, that were shipped by the camera manufacturers that belong to CIPA in November 2020, for instance, it was 2/3 were mirrorless. Now, that still means that over 30% of these cameras were DSLRs. So yes, 2/3 of all cameras were mirrorless, but don't forget that there's probably at least 3/4 of all photographers in the world are enthusiasts and they're hobbyists. So very few people who buy a camera are actually doing pro work, and all the camera manufacturers are aware of that. That's why also you'll see, for instance, when Nikon started coming out with the Z6, Z7, they didn't have all the pro features on there, for instance, like dual card slots, something I'll touch on again, but they were geared toward creating. That's how they marketed their push for it, instead of, hey, this is our professional market. Give you another example on that too, is that Nikon is still pushing heavily their DSLRs. In fact, they just came out with the D780. It's a very pricey camera since it runs a lot more. I'm going to get into some of the pricing here on that because it could be an option. If you're a Nikon fan, you really want something new, but it wouldn't be one of mine. Also, Canon still is selling a lot of the 5D Mark IVs. Fantastic camera. Not too bad of a price for what you get, $2,500. Yeah, that's a bit pricey for a real estate photography camera, but if you're doing weddings and other type of work and you're a Canon shooter, you probably know the 5D Mark IV is a fantastic camera for the quality, the longevity, the build, everything that goes along with that. So those are still being pushed. Nikon and Canon are still going very strong with that. And we have to think too that the switch from DSLR to mirrorless, or that transition I should say, is different than trying to compare it to the film to digital transition that took place. So the assets at the end of the day that you get out of a camera, whether it's mirrorless or DSLR, really you can't tell. I mean, yes, you may have a better quality camera in some aspects, but just because it's mirrorless or just because it's DSLR doesn't differentiate that. You still, at the end of the day, have a digital file. You have a RAW file or a JPEG, you have an MP4, or you have some other type of video file. It's all digital assets. This is completely different than film, where the workflow was much more intense, than of having a dark room and working with chemicals. So also another thing, DSLRs are much easier to find refurbished, right? So they come at a lower cost. And that's something that I do. I don't buy new camera bodies. It's very rare that I do. I buy Nikon stuff. Here's one sitting here, one of my D610s with a Takina lens. I'm going to talk about that combination here shortly. But I picked those things up refurbished at a fraction of the cost of what the new cameras would go for. So something to bear in mind when you're shopping for stuff. Now, I'm not talking about used, I'm talking about refurbished, because refurbished is where they put in, like for instance, a new sensor, they put in a new shutter mechanism. The body might have a few scratches on it, but everything else has been cleaned up and renewed inside of it. Also, another one of the things to think about as some of the high-level recommendations when we get into here, mirrorless is going to cost more because you don't have as much refurbished options. And when you're looking at either one, whether it's going to be DSLR or mirrorless, is you really want to try to find something full frame. That's my recommendation. I know immediately some people are like, well, I have a crop sensor camera. That's crazy. I shoot great stuff with a crop sensor camera for real estate photography. You don't need full frame. And I would say, yes, you're absolutely correct. You can shoot real estate photography with a cropped sensor camera. You can also shoot real estate photography with an iPhone 12. It's a different type of result. And yes, you can get good results out of it. But here's a couple things to think about. One, and I've talked about this before, is if all you're going to do is shoot just for real estate agents and just MLS listings, yeah, you can get by with a crop sensor camera. You want to start shooting for magazines, builders, developers, you really want to push your game higher, then you're going to think about getting in a full frame. Also, what other genres of photography do you want to shoot professionally? So yes, all of us real estate photographers shoot real estate, but we also shoot other stuff. One of the other things I specialize in is corporate headshots. And so with that, yes, I've got a lot of versatility then on the various camera bodies that I have. When I talked about retiring some of my D610s, for instance, they then get retired over. I don't do as much portrait work, so guess what one of my portrait cameras are? It's one with over 100,000 clicks on that. So anyways, though, I get a real good quality out of that, and people can argue the number of megapixels, but remember that full frame sensors have typically bigger photo sites. So in other words, each one of the little sensors on the sensor, each one of those little photo sites tend to be bigger. And that brings in a lot more detail, a lot more light. This, for instance, is one of the reasons why the Panasonic Lumix, they turn out to be very good video cameras, because even though they might have a micro four thirds sensor, they have very large photo sites, so allowing them to get better color and all that. The problem, of course, though, that's video, which is only 1920 pixels wide if you're shooting 1080, a little bit bigger if you're shooting 4K. But when you're talking about providing digital assets for real estate photography, yes, they probably will be bigger, and people go, well, it's just online. No, it's not. It actually is printed material. I've even had some of my stuff go up on billboards. So something just to think about there. Also, you will have a lot more pixels to play with. So you can, as I show in the exteriors book, you will have the ability to stand way back on a house if you're doing an exterior, crop it way down. You have a different type of effective focal length. Same with doing the fake tilt shift stuff for interiors. So having the full frame gives you a lot of versatility, but the biggest thing with that argument is that you also don't have to worry about not just the crop that comes out of that full frame, but you also have that big versatility along with that. So something to think about with that. Keeping it around the 20-30 megapixel range is usually more than enough when it comes to real estate photography. So once again, you've got a full frame camera with a 20-30 megapixel sensor on there with big photo sites. It's a fantastic camera to use. So you're not going to have that go away anytime soon. And quite honestly, those type of cameras don't cost much more nowadays than cropped sensor cameras. If you find a cropped sensor camera that is magnitudes lower than a full frame camera, I can guarantee the quality is just not going to be there. You can prove it to yourself. Go to dxomark.com. You can compare it to other cameras, and I'm going to be doing that later on in this video as well. Also, another thing to look for if you're doing pro work of any type is that dual card slot. So most cameras have a dual SD card slot, and that allows you to then not just have an overflow so you have more capacity, but immediately back up images that were taken. So this is something that a lot of pros bagged on when the Nikon Z6 came out, for instance, because they just had one card slot. And I'm going to talk about that and the compatibility of that card slot and what they're doing with the Z6 II coming up in the video later. But something to look for as some of our fundamentals. So once again, there are about two main choices when it comes to DSLRs, Nikon and Canon. Sony is mirrorless game. We're going to cover that here shortly. So talking about Nikon and Canon. When it comes to the Nikon, my recommendation still to this day, even going in, I know it's an older camera, but it's the D610. That's this guy sitting here with a Taquina on it. It's my workhorse, and it's not just me that's deciding that, oh yes, this is a great camera to use. This is still offered at Nikon's website under their latest. It's not obsolete. No matter what you read in some of the articles this last year on some of these photo blogs that, oh, it's now obsolete, the D610. No, they're still making and shipping the D610s, and it was such a popular camera for so many years that when they would come out with something new, then the enthusiast market, the hobbyist market, which is much got a higher population than the pro market, they were always upselling. So a lot of these bodies were barely used. Then they get refurbished, put back on the market because so many people were now trying to trade up and get something bigger, better, or whatever. So you can pick the one up, D610 refurbished, anywhere from about $650 to $800. That's it. Full frame camera, 24 megapixel, fantastic quality. Go to my website, take a look at my portfolio. It's all shot with the D610. So if you buy a new one, they run anywhere from about $1,300 to about $1,600. Now, there is the newer D750. That's a few years old now. That's about $1,500 new. It's harder to find refurbished because there weren't as many sales of the D750 for people to scale up from, but you can still find it refurbished for about $1,000 to $1,300. Once again, new is about $1,500. The new D780 by Nikon is not a real estate photography camera of my choosing, only because of the price. It's $2,300 per body. So if I need two of those, that's $4,600 for my bodies compared to buying a couple of D650s for just $1,300 for two bodies, about $650 each. Now, even at the high end, $800 if they were refurbished each for a D610, it's still not even the price of, it's about 2/3 the price of a D780 new. So that would be my recommendation for Nikon. I'm going to talk about the lens pairing with that and the various options here shortly, but let's talk about Canon. Now, Canon, the 5D Mark IV is a fantastic camera. It is a bit pricey. If you already have something along those lines, great, you've got a fantastic camera. You're thinking about getting a Canon camera, instead you don't have something yet, or maybe you want to get a full frame compared to something cropped, then my recommendation would be the Canon 6D Mark II. It's a step up from the original Canon 6D. It's got a little better review. I'll talk about the quality comparisons also later in the video, but you can pick it up for about $1,400 new. Not bad. It's harder to find this refurbished, and the refurbished price isn't much lower at about $1,250. So if you're thinking about one, you might want to think about just going new on that. Another thing too, though, is that the 6D2 only has one card slot. Now, if you're using really good SD cards, it might not be something to worry about so much. I wouldn't trust my work in the field that I have to go back now and shoot something because something got corrupted on a card. It's very rare for that to happen, but it is a chance that you'd have to take. If you're starting to enter this market, something to consider if you're willing to take that chance. Now, there are other more expensive cameras, bodies by Canon, like the 5D Mark IV, that do have dual card slots. But once again, $2,500 for a 5D Mark IV, a little bit pricey, but I would recommend that camera quality-wise and also because of the dual card slots. But when it comes to trying to be pragmatic and what do you find for the price difference, then yeah, a 6D Mark II would be good. But I would still recommend the Nikon over that, not because I'm a Nikon shooter, but just because, for one, the refurbished price is a lot lower and you get the dual card slots with that. So next, before getting into the mirrorless stuff, let's finish off the DSLR stuff by talking about the DSLR lenses. Now, as you probably already know, if you've seen my other videos, if you have any of my books, you know that my top choice for interior lens, whether it's for Nikon or Canon, is the Nikon 16-28 f2.8. That's what's mounted, by the way, on the camera over here on my desk. So the Nikon 16-28 f2.8, fantastic lens, brand new, $700. And you think to yourself, well, for that price compared to some of the OEM lenses, can it be good? It's a fantastic lens. So once again, you go to my website, look at any interior photo right now that is over there at nathancoolphoto.com, and you will see all those interior photos are done with that lens. It's fantastic. It's superb. Now, there will be a lot of people that complain about the flares that you get off of that. I'm going to cover that next after talking about a couple more lenses, because that isn't the only lens that can suffer from that, and it is a natural thing to occur. I'm going to describe why and what lenses don't necessarily have that. So the Nikon now, they offer this in what they call their Opera line. So before they would run these lenses for $400 or $500. Now with the Opera line, they're $700, but they come in Canon and Nikon full frame mounts. Now, the more expensive version of that, if you were to be on a Nikon, would be the Nikon 14-24 f2.8. And new is anywhere from $1,700 to about $2,000 for a new Nikon equivalent of that Tachina lens. Renewed, you can get it for about $1,300, but that's still you know, just about twice as much as a brand new Tachina lens on that. Nikon also has a 16 to 35 f4 lens, but if you've ever had f2.8 lenses compared to f4 lenses, you know that the f4 tends to be of a typical lower quality. Also, the brand new 16 to 35 f4 by Nikon runs $1,100. It's still more, even renewed, it's about $900. Still more than just buying the Tachina 16 to 28 f2.8. Canon also has a 16 to 35 EF f4. There's a few different flavors of that. It runs about $1,100. If you were to go with their f2.8, they once again are very high like Nikon, and that would be a $2,200 investment. So once again, I really prefer to use the Tachina 16 to 28. It's a workhorse. It's done a fantastic job for me over the years. This is actually the second one that I've owned because the first one I used it so much that I just was like, well, maybe I'll use it as a backup after a couple years, because after having about 250,000 shutter clicks, focusing on that particular camera, I was like, well, motor's still going strong, but I'll just use it as a backup for now. But even the newer ones that I've bought, they're just fantastic, very solidly built. And anyways, you can judge that for yourself. Once again, links are down in the description for this video, so you can check all that out. Now, I mentioned about the flare that can come off of that Tachina lens, and it also will happen off of most of your f2.8 lenses, especially the Nikon 14 to 24, and that's because of this bulbous element that's at the front of the lenses. So to be able to go really super wide, these lenses typically only have a built-in tulip lens hood. So you also typically can't put filters on there very easily in front of the lens. You can't get the screw-on types, at least. Also, it will be somewhat, that bulbous will start picking up flares. Try to use this outside, and it's just going to be a flare monster. You know, I've used it for some twilight shoots and does super fantastic. Gets fantastic starburst flares, but outside you'll get streaks and haze and all kinds of stuff if you're even anywhere near the sun. It's just because of that bulbous element. So for that reason, that's why I use a different lens when it comes to exterior work. But the exterior lenses that I recommend aren't just because of that one reason alone. So exteriors, when we take a look at that, those things are so much more relatable to people. The color of the grass, the color of the sky, the richness, the saturation that we want to bring out. Also, when doing higher end architectural work, if you want to have something that really pops, then you really go to like a prime lens. And that's why I recommend using a really good prime lens for doing exteriors. Now, it also works as a great backup to your interior, so if this lens were to fail, I've got a wide enough exterior lens where I could just use that entire camera and at least get through a shoot if I needed to. So 20 millimeters typically is a sweet spot for a prime lens for doing the exterior work. And so what I like to do, I've mentioned earlier, I have two bodies with me on site. One has a 20 millimeter lens married to it, and the other has the Tachina 16 to 28 married to it. So I like to use the Nikon 20 millimeter f1.8 lens. It's $800. It is a pricey lens. But when married to a $650 or $800 full frame body, yeah, the total investment isn't bad, and the results are just phenomenal. Using a prime lens, I'm also using a much lighter setup, so I just hand carry it, and I can quickly do my exteriors, boom, 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 walking around, not setting up my tripod every single time, except for obviously doing twilight exteriors. So Canon, Nikon, Sigma, that's the Sigma, excuse me, is the alternative then when you get into Canon, but it can also be used for Nikon. Canon has like 24 millimeter lens, that's fine, but really when you take a look at what Sigma does, their lenses are far superior than some of what Canon and Nikon make. In fact, the Sigma Art 20 millimeter f1.4 would be my recommendation for Canon for doing exteriors, and something to consider also for Nikon shooters as well. It runs $900. It's $100 more than what I'd recommend for the Nikon 20 millimeter, but it is just a fantastic lens. So something to consider there. So that kind of wraps up then the DSLR. Next, we need to address the mirrorless. So let's dive into what we can do with mirrorless cameras and then mirrorless lenses, and then we'll start diving into comparisons and all the rest of the agenda. So while DSLRs provide you a very pragmatic, cost-effective yet low-cost way to manage your budget for the cameras and lenses that you're looking for real estate photography, if you're considering getting into the mirrorless, then that's what we got to talk about next. Eventually, I'd say 10, 15 years from now, we'll all be mirrorless, but there's still a slow transition to that. And once again, with bodies coming and going, and also with not yet quite the availability of lenses for some of these manufacturers making mirrorless cameras, we're still a long ways off. So DSLR is still a very viable choice, even in 2021, for real estate photography. But let's talk about mirrorless. If you're thinking about cutting to the chase here of getting into mirrorless at all, my recommendation is Sony, without a doubt. So Sony is still making and selling the a7 III. Fantastic camera, about $2,000 new, $1,700 renewed. It's a fantastic quality camera. A lot of people rave about it. Does fantastic video work. Jonathan, my drone partner, he has one doing for video. A fantastic camera. I love it too. But it is a little bit pricey to get into. Sometimes you can find it on sale for about $1,600, and it depends. I'm sure it'll go on sale even more later this year because they have the a7S III out. Fantastic camera also, but it costs $3,500 for a body. So as more people, if they start moving toward the a7S III, and once again, don't forget, a lot of hobbyists out there, that's what drives the price of this stuff. A7 III, not the a7S III, will probably become more available, so might get some sales on that, but still not bad entry point for a camera. Also, the a7 III has those dual card slots, so very, very good. And those are SD card slots, which some of these mirrorless cameras don't necessarily have. So moving ahead, if you're a Nikon shooter and you're thinking about staying in the Nikon ecosystem, you've probably taken a look at the Z6, and it's about $1,600 new. It's not a bad price point. It only has a single card slot, but to add insult to injury, it's an XQD card. It's not SD. So you're really not in the Nikon ecosystem any longer. And yes, all these cameras can take an adapter, and you can use your existing lenses for these cameras. But at that point, it's just putting band-aids on stuff. It's not necessarily bad, especially if you buy a camera and you buy some lenses that are within, entirely compatible for that, and you just have a few other lenses that eventually you may upgrade. But for right now, it gets you through that transition period. But it's not really what I would do going forward. Also, the Z6 is coming out with a newer one, supposedly this year. It'll be the Z6 II. And they're boasting dual card slots. Well, one of those slots is SD, the other is still XQD. So it's so that you can use SD cards instead of XQD, but it still doesn't have that pro feature of automatic backup to another card. So that's something to consider. So the Z6 is not really my recommendation for real estate photography. I don't think it's quite there yet. I think they're getting there. The price point though isn't bad. If you were to start out completely new and you really wanted to buy Nikon, I wouldn't steer you entirely away from the Z6, but it wouldn't be my recommendation for real estate photography right now. The Canon is also coming out with their R line. They have the R6, $2,500 new, also has dual card slots, so something to consider there. You're a Canon shooter, they already have a pro feature that's above that, and you're getting some better quality too. I'll talk about that when we get into the R series, so not a bad deal. Fuji has the X-T4, and it's the last I'll talk about Fuji. It is a crop sensor camera, and it's one of those that I would definitely recommend for video. It comes in at a decent price point at about $1,700 new. It has 26 megapixel sensor. Once again, it's the crop sensor, so it has smaller photo cells than the full frame version of a camera that would have even 20 megapixels. But it is, since it's a great video camera, and if you're doing more video than you are doing stills, it does decent still work. I know photographers that use nothing but Fujifilm cameras, so I wouldn't steer you away from it. If you're geared toward Fuji, and especially for doing a lot of video, if you're doing that primarily more than stills, it's a viable option, but I'll let that rest right here. It's completely untested by me. None of us have Fuji, so I only know other photographers that do. So real quickly, let's now jump into the mirrorless lenses that we have for those mirrorless cameras. And Sony has just a whole bunch of choices to use for lenses. That's why it's one of my recommendations if you're getting into mirrorless, using like the Sony a7 III. They have, for instance, the Sony FE 12-24 f4 lens, which is a really good f4 lens at $1,700. Their f2.8 version of that is $3,000. So there are those still a lot of third-party options that you can use for lenses. For instance, there's the Sigma 14-24 f2.8, $1,400, and also a great lens is the Tamra 17-28 f2.8, which comes in at just $900. So you've got quite a bit of choice when it comes to using the Sony, and especially once again if you're using just the a7 III. And of course, you can also use an adapter on a Sony camera for other types of lenses you may have for other brands of cameras. The Nikon Z, when we take a look at the lenses for that, there's just not a wide selection. Tokina, for instance, you could use the Tokina lens on there. They have what they call the FTZ adapter. It's $250, you know, to add on top of your lens prices there. The Nikon Z has a 14-30 f4 lens, which runs $1,100. Now, that may be an option, but once again, this whole setup is just not striking me as something pro quality for real estate photography yet. I think it's just about there, but not in my recommendation. So Canon R is also suffering from that as well. Not a whole lot of lens choices to select from. They do have an adapter, the EOS R, and it's not badly priced. It's fairly cheap. And also Canon has a couple of lenses to possibly consider. They have an RF 15-35 f2.8, but that's $2,300. They've also, besides that, which is really about the only thing in the R series, unless you use an adapter and some other Canon lens on there, which at this point you're just having almost a DSLR setup, right? Except you've got some of the benefits of using the mirrorless camera. But there's also a really good lens, the Samyang AF. It actually is an autofocus lens, 14 millimeter. It's fixed. Yeah, you'd be shooting everything at 14 millimeters, but it's an f2.8 lens at only $600. So something to consider. But once again, doing pro work with not having a lot of choices for lenses, neither Nikon Z or Canon R are in my recommendations. If you're going to go mirrorless in 2021 and really looking to expand, you've got a lot more choices if you're to go the Sony route. Once again, the Fuji X, I mentioned just a little bit about the X-T4. Those lenses are limited. There's hardly any third-party options that are out there. They have a 10-24 f4 lens of Fuji, which is, since it's a crop sensor camera, it's a 15-36 millimeter equivalent on full frame, but there's just not much out there to offer. They have also a f2.8 lens at 8-16 millimeters, which is a 12-24 millimeter equivalent at $2,000. But anyway, once again, it's only if you're doing primarily video compared to stills for real estate photography that I would recommend getting into the Fuji line, the X-T4. Not a bad camera. They do a fantastic job, always have for years, but just not pragmatic for real estate photography. So now I'd like to talk about the quality of different things, how that then compares. So those are my recommendations based off mostly price, availability, but how do these really line up when you take a look at what kind of quality they can produce. Then I'm going to cover after that a little bit of tilt shift lenses and then my final recommendations. But first, let's get into quality. So here we'll take a look first at the three camera bodies that I've been recommending: the Nikon D610, the Canon 6D Mark II, and the Sony a7 III. We can see the dynamic range is a pretty good judge of how things are going to work when we do interior work, especially because, and also a lot for exterior work too, but also for interior work, the dynamic range will also have an effect quite often on how well things auto white balance, and which of course, you know, using flash, this is something that we often rely on. So it's a good measure of using these cameras for interior work, and of course secondary for the exterior work. We can see at the lower ISO levels that we have pretty low ratings on the Canon, on the 6D Mark II. Interestingly enough, the old Nikon D610, my favorite, very low cost camera body, is keeping up with Sony until we get past about ISO 400. That's when it starts to falter a little bit, but of course then it really falters more once we get up to probably about ISO 1000, where the Sony is just king at the higher ISOs. But if we're doing most real estate photography work, you're never even going to reach ISO 400. So really still we have fantastic results that are coming out of the D610. But once again, we look at the 6D, it's just not going to live up to the reputation and the quality of like the 5D Mark IV, which is of course the more expensive body, but still it's not that bad. It does do fairly well at the higher ISOs, but just doesn't have, by the way, signal to noise ratio and tonal range and all those others were fairly well, so they weren't all that bad. So let's take a look then real quickly at the mirrorless bodies, because that's a little bit different. So what I did here, and by the way, this is all using dxomark.com. You go there and you can take a look at any camera, any lens, almost any camera, almost any lens. They do a ton of testing. They've got fantastic results. And no, they did not sponsor this video. I have nothing to do with them. I just use their services quite a bit when I'm trying to make my own business decisions. So taking a look here at the three bodies here, this was using the Sony a7 III, Nikon Z6, and the Canon R6, the EOS. So we can see that the Sony a7 III is king. It does get fairly close. It's got an overall score of 96. The Z6 overall score 95. So they're kind of neck and neck a lot of ways, but the R6 is down to 90, which still is a very good score. It's not bad. It's just that it's not really up to par yet with, you know, Sony or the Nikon Z6. And of course, all the other benefits of having the Sony a7 III that I mentioned, and especially with this type of quality, definitely puts it as a leader, as a choice. So now when we take a look at the lenses, when we compare those, let's take a look first at doing some lens compare on the Nikon stuff. So here I've got the standard 14-24 f2.8, the real expensive one made by Nikon, and then we've got the 16-35 f4, which is the lower quality but of course lower cost option, and then my favorite on the far right, which is the Tachyna 16-28. We can see that the Tachyna 16-28 beats out the f4 on the Nikon for quality, so it has its overall rating is about a 23 compared to about a 22 on the f4, but of course the Nikkor 14-24 is still going to be the best. It's a fantastic lens at 27. But do you need to spend that much more money? It's a lot more money, you know, thousands more than what you would pay for the Tachyna. So that's why Tachyna, it's not quite the quality of the 14-24, but it's so negligible when it comes to real estate photography. Is the 16-35 f4 not worth it at just a score of 22? No, it's not completely out of the running. It's just not quite as high quality as the 16-28 Tachyna. So that's how that compares. If we take a look now at comparing the Canon lenses. So there's different flavors of the Canon's 16-35 f4 lens. So this happened to be just one that I took a look at to get a pretty good idea compared to the f2.8 line, and then try to compare this to the Tachyna. And of course this was then assumed to be mounted on a Canon EOS 6D, which DxOMark doesn't have the 6D Mark II yet tested, so for these lenses. But as you can see, in all these cases, the Tachyna ranked higher. So the Tachyna comes out at a 22 compared to 19 and 21 on these other Canon lenses. Now you can take a look at the other flavor of Canon lenses or other lenses and see how those match up. But this is once again where Tachina still excels in a lot of areas for what we've got. Now, unfortunately, I can't really judge the Sony lenses on here because DxOMark hasn't gone to the extent of testing those on the Sony bodies, but I can assure you that they do get fantastic reviews, and of course you can research that yourself, but it is something to consider that yes, Sony does make great lenses, so you can't really go wrong with that option. But anyways, take a look if you're going to go the Canon route or the Nikon route. Either way, it is the Tachina 16 to 28 f2.8 for either Canon or Nikon DSLRs. So just a couple more things here to cover this whole thing. I want to talk a little bit about tilt shift lenses, and then I want to give you my 3 recommendations based off of everything that I've talked about here. So there used to be a school of thought back in the film days that if you wanted to show things with the best perspective possible, then and to avoid converging lines, a tilt shift lens was the way to go. The digital world has changed that a lot. In fact, I don't use a tilt shift lens. Now you'll read bloggers that will tell you that you gotta have a tilt shift lens for doing real estate photography. It'll change your life. It might, you know, but it's a great lens to have. It can do fantastic stuff. Do you want to make money? Well, one, you can save money by not having a tilt shift lens, and you can also shoot a lot faster while you're on site without one. And also you don't have to worry about like damaging the bulbous front end element. There could be times where a tilt shift lens could come in handy for some stuff, but I got to tell you, after years of doing this and doing this for real estate photography for all kinds of types of clients, I still haven't found a need that I really required to have one. So if it ever came up, I would rent one. I always told myself that, and I still to this day haven't rented one. So, but if you are looking toward a tilt shift, you can take a look at the Nikon. If you've got a Nikon camera, they've got a 19mm tilt shift, which is $3,400. Now they have a longer focal length, which is less, but the 19mm is really what you'd be looking for a lot of real estate photography, and that's quite an investment. Canon, if you're going that route, you can get a tilt shift lens for cheaper, about $2,100, $2,150 for their 17mm. Rokinon makes a tilt shift lens compatible with different bodies, $700, $800. If you're going to go that route and get a tilt shift, you're getting it for the quality. I wouldn't mess around with getting a different third-party lens, especially I've heard mixed reviews on it. It's kept me from buying it, for instance. And once again, I'm not a tilt shift user, so I don't really recommend tilt shift. Instead, and I've shown this you can look for a tilt shift in the search on my YouTube channel, and you'll see where I'll shoot high, I'll shoot wide, and then in post I crop down from the top. Looks like I did it with a tilt shift. So it's a very simple process. Also for big like foyers and stuff, I've got another video where I show it's like, yeah, I looked straight up, had converging lines, but after doing some vertical correction and then some content aware fill, boom, done. I got myself a fake tilt shift, and I used this Tachina 16-28 lens to do it. So I didn't need it. If you feel that you really need to or you want to try it out, you can always rent one first from like borrowlenses.com or something like that. So anyways, let's wrap this up then with some of the lowest final costs, my 3 recommendations, and what would they be? First recommendation is what I have, of course, sitting on my desk, and it's one of the lowest priced, yet most cost-effective, highest quality options that are pragmatic for doing real estate photography business, which is the Nikon D610, which is anywhere from $650 to $800 refurbished. Add a Tachina lens onto that, and you're looking at a total investment of a camera plus lens. You're taking a look at a starting price of about $1,350. Next up, if you're looking for something pragmatic, once again, cost-effective wise, the 6D Mark II. If you're a Canon fan, that's about $1,250 refurbished if you can find it. Once again, the body price brand new is probably about $1,400, not much more. But you just add a Tachina lens for $700 and you're at about, right about $2,000, right under that. Maybe a little bit more if you're looking to get a newer body on the 6D Mark II. If you're going to go the 5D Mark IV, obviously you're going to be paying add another maybe up to $1,000 on top of that for the body. And of course, my highest recommendation, if you're going to go the mirrorless route, if you're still thinking about DSLRs, my last two, especially using the Nikon D610, but if you're going to go the mirrorless route, then I recommend the Sony a7 III. Not the a7S III, the a7 III. That camera will still be around for a long time. By the time you wear out that body, the a7S III will have refurbished bodies out there, or at least a price drop, so you can definitely get by with that. So you can get a7 III renewed, refurbished for about $1,700, brand new for about $2,000. Once again, I think they'll really go on sale later this year as more people get into the a7S. You can also then get with that Tamron lens, which is a $900 lens. So really, if you're getting a renewed a7 III plus the Tamron lens, you're looking at about a $2,600 investment. So that's not bad, especially if you're looking at getting into the pro arena with a really good mirrorless camera. So anyways, there's a lot that has to always be considered when you're going to choose any gear for any photography business. I make a lot of recommendations throughout my book, not just in the particular gear, but also why, things to look for, viability, and of course I have a link to all that down in the description for this video. I hope you did like this video. I hope that you can use some of this information in your photography career as well. If you did like this video and you want to see more, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. It won't cost anything, and as soon as one of these videos is posted, you'll be the first to know. Thanks a lot for watching. Until next time, take care, be safe, and get out there and shoot something.